Has it ever happened to you that you're trying to pronounce a word in a language you're trying to learn, whether it be Italian, Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, French, English, but then you feel awkward trying to pronounce it the way native speakers do? Do you ever feel awkward? And most importantly, should you? Hello noble ones, and welcome to Metatron's Academy, the channel where we explore how to learn languages in the most fun and effective way possible. So today we're going to talk about this idea of feeling awkward when trying to pronounce something the French way, the Italian way, the English way, the American way, whatever language you're trying to learn, it feels weird. And there are mostly two situations, two scenarios that we're going to tackle today. Scenario number one, when you're actually speaking the language. This is something that does happen occasionally. Of course, you have people that just cannot do it. Like, they don't have a good ear, so no matter how hard they try, they will tend to just pronounce the language using their own matrix or pronunciation, vowel and consonant systems within their own native tongues, and then they just apply it to the foreign language that they're trying to learn. So basically speaking English with an Italian accent, speaking French with an American accent, and so on and so forth. And of course, on the other side of the spectrum, you've got people that basically just sound like natives when they speak it. They're so natural. But then you've got someone in between. And this could be you, or it may have been you at some point. And by someone in between, I mean someone who you have the ability to at least try. Perhaps you won't sound identical to a native. Of course, you won't. In the sense that you're in between. You have the capability to sound closer, not exactly like a native, but definitely closer to a native. You notice some things that they do. You think you can replicate it, but you don't do it because of social pressure. You don't do it because perhaps in your classroom, if you do that, people are going to look at you weird. They're going to think you're awkward. They're going to think you're obnoxious or arrogant. You feel awkward when you try and pronounce things the way natives actually do, and therefore you don't. You basically drop it and you just use your own native pronunciation system. The second scenario we're going to address is when you feel awkward pronouncing a word the way it's meant to be pronounced in its original language when you're using a word alone. So, for example, you're an English speaker, you're speaking English, and then at one point you're using a word, whether it be in Mandarin, in Japanese, or in Italian, in Spanish, but you pronounce it the English way because just switching to that word and pronouncing it correctly, once again, makes you feel awkward. Let's begin with the first one. So the first situation is actually quite easy to address because that one is really a black and white scenario. You should not feel awkward at all. If you have the ability to at least try and pronounce things the way they're meant to be pronounced in the receiving language, it's not something you should feel awkward about because it is all part of learning the language. Thinking that you can learn a language, ignoring completely pronunciation, is a massive obstacle that will impede your progress. Given, as I was saying, some people, they just, they do what they can, and that's okay. But if you do have the ability, and you notice, for example, a word such as tough, I mean, if I were to pronounce it the Italian way, I would say tog. And even if someone tells me, no, the G's pronounced like an F, and I go, tof, I feel like that could impede conversation, like people might not understand me. So trying to pronounce things is actually the way native speakers do in their own language, within any given accent you choose to try and obtain, is a great way to increase pronunciation, because even though it may sound awkward to you, it will not sound awkward to them, because that's how it's naturally pronounced in that language. So this whole idea of, oh, maybe people are gonna think that I am weird, or that I'm arrogant, or, they call me obnoxious if when I speak French, I try to do the R the French way, or I try to pronounce the vowels in English the way English people do, or I try to speak Italian with an Italian accent. People from those countries, as long as you don't do it too much, so as long as you don't overcompensate and then sound too unnatural, as long as you do it a little bit and you try and get better with time, trying to, mimic how people pronounce things, that's just gonna make you sound more proficient. And if you are in a classroom and your classmates don't like you because you're trying to do that, that's their problem. And when I say it's their problem, it literally is their problem. Because if they don't want you to do it, but then they do it, they're hypocrites. Fucking ignore them. And on the other hand, if, say, you're trying to learn Japanese or Chinese or Italian, and then they just keep on pronouncing it with a very thick, from the perspective of the receiving language, foreign accent, and they just don't want to do that, that's once again their problem. They might have problems with communication, particularly with pitch-based and tone-based language. Good luck with that. And even with a language like Spanish and Italian, if you don't even try to get a little closer to how that language is supposed to be pronounced, you're not really showing that you care about the culture, the language, and the people of that country. So what would you rather choose? To create a possible, not even necessarily going to happen, but a possible awkward situation and negative impression with some jealous classmates, or to have that same situation with natives in the country where you're going to go? Who cares about your classmates? Once again, their problem. But now let's have a look at the second scenario, because that one it's a little bit more nuanced. What about if I am speaking English right now, and then at one point I want to use a word in Japanese, in Italian, in French, in Mandarin? Should I feel awkward about pronouncing that word the correct way if I know how to say it? Is it gonna piss people off? Is there any positive aspect of doing that, or is it just like showing off? Well, it's a case-by-case scenario. Let me give you some examples. If you're a language teacher and you're teaching students, or even if you're just telling your sister how to say something because she knows you're studying Mandarin and she asks you, how do you say cup of tea? Then you should pronounce it correctly because you're teaching. So if you are in the process of teaching, always pronounce it correctly. So if someone were to ask me, how do you say raw fish in Japanese? I'm not just going to say, oh, it's just sushi. I'll say sushi. I'll say it correctly. I'll say the way the Japanese pronounce it. Same way someone asks me how to pronounce something in Italian, if you know how to say it, you should pronounce it correctly because, again, you're teaching. On the other hand, let's say that you are at a restaurant and you are ordering food. Now, as an Italian, I do have the tendency to still pronounce tortellini, ravioli, spaghetti. But if you're American, even though you know that it's pronounced spaghetti, if you're speaking with a waiter and they're also American, and you just want to say, oh, just a dish of spaghetti, it's okay. In fact, depending on the language, you might make it difficult for a waiter because, I mean, spaghetti, spaghetti, you can still recognize it. But if you start pronouncing Japanese or Chinese properly in a restaurant and perhaps the waiter is not Chinese, you can make it difficult for them. So in that case, I would just pronounce it with an English accent, and who cares? Now, these are kind of two extreme scenarios, but there are many in-between sort of grey areas where I believe you'll have to exercise your best judgment. For instance, as a content creator, I sometimes find myself in a little bit of a difficult situation when it comes to this. Let me explain why. Now, this has happened multiple times on my channel, but let's say that I'm making a video and I'm talking about Japanese martial arts. Now, here's the problem. I'm gonna use these terms a lot if I'm making an entire video about Japanese martial arts. So how am I going to pronounce them? Am I going to every single time slow down the conversation, switch into Japanese pronunciation, and then return to English pronunciation every single time I pronounce these words? That, in my experience, does not produce a good feeling, and in fact, people are gonna get mad. Let me give you an example. Today I'd like to talk about the samurai, and one of the weapons that the samurai use is the yari. Now, one of the reasons why I really like the yari is because compared to the katana, the yari... Okay, I'll just leave it at that. I think I made my point there. It sounds unnatural, it sounds awkward, and to be honest, it does sound like I just want to show off that I know how to pronounce these words in Japanese. But the reason why I say it's kind of a difficult situation as a content creator is because if I do the opposite thing, meaning this one, today I'd like to talk about the samurai. And one of the things about the samurai that I really like is that whenever you use the yari, compared to the katana, the yari is really good because if I do this, people will think that I don't know Japanese. But I do. And so these two scenarios create these two situations. Scenario one, I'll get these comments. Oh man, you're so obnoxious. Why do you have to keep on pronouncing it the weird way? Just say normally. Speak like you eat. You're horrible. Unsubscribed. Scenario number two. What? And you said you knew Japanese and you're a Japanese teacher? You don't know shit. It's horrible. Who do you think you are? Unsubscribed. So no matter what you do, you will get hate regardless in a situation like mine. So what's the best way to tackle it? In my experience, what has sort of provided the best results is the following. What I do is that I will pronounce the word correctly once on the video. This is good because first it kind of establishes that, yeah, I do know how to pronounce it, and then if people do want to learn it, then they can use that scenario, that very first mention, but then it's not gonna bother you for the entirety of the rest of the video. So this is what's gonna sound like. Okay, today we're gonna talk about the samurai and specifically about two different weapons, the yari and the katana. Now, for those of you who are interested in Japanese, these are pronounced yari, katana, and samurai, If you want to know more about this, you'll find a link in the description. So one of the things I really like about the katana is that, when a samurai uses a katana, and then I just go on normally for the rest of the video. In my opinion, this is the best situation, and a compromise like this can be used in a lot of those cases that you may find yourself in as someone proficient in a language where you're thinking, should I pronounce it right or should I not pronounce it right? It really is a case-by-case scenario. Let's look at city names, for example. It's really weird when it comes to city names because some cities do have a counterpart translated into English, for example. Say the city name Roma in Italian, which becomes Rome. Now, every time you speak about Rome, should you say Roma every single time if you know how to pronounce it? I would say no. That would be really kind of, as an Italian, I don't even do that. I just talk about Rome. But there could be situations where, if someone asks you, oh, so you've been to Rome? How do Italians say that? And you can say, oh yeah, in Italy it's pronounced Roma. I really like how it sounds. But yeah, Rome is a fantastic city. So that way, you've answered, you've taught, you don't sound obnoxious. In fact, you sound proficient. And then it's fine because you keep on, you switch it to English. Now, that one is the easiest one because people are actually asking. What if they're not asking? But for example, if I was giving a public speech, which I used to do very often back in the day, I think it kind of brings in some flair and some interesting points in a conversation, as long as you don't overdo it, as I was saying, similarly to what I did with the example with the video about the samurai. So, for instance, if I was giving a public talk about Rome, and I could, I'm speaking about Rome, its history, and all of the other things, and at one point, I could say, today we're going to talk about Rome or Roma. So one of the characteristics of Rome is, and then that's it. I just gave it once, created a little flair, makes it interesting, it's educational, and you leave it at that. You could do the same in Chinese, for example, if I'm talking about Beijing. At one point I could say, now let's talk about China. Now, of course, the capital of China is Beijing, or as they say it, Beijing, since it's a tonal language. And one of the characteristics of Beijing is that the city was founded in blah, blah, blah. And that's that. But in general, the final message that I'd like to bring in with this is that even though there are some little scenarios in which overdoing it, doing it too much, or doing it in a situation where it could cause some misunderstanding, should be avoided. Pronouncing things correctly, exception being these examples I just made, pronouncing things correctly is a good thing. It shows that you care about the culture. It shows that you care about the people and the language and how they understand you and how easily you can be understood. It helps your communication. It makes you sound more proficient. For example, during a job interview, you want to show that one off. And in general, I would say, if people are going to judge you negatively because you're showing proficiency in situations where you should be using it and should be showing it, then they're jealous, they're envious. And you shouldn't base or limit your abilities and skills based on someone else's envy. If they're jealous about it, it's their problem. You are a language student. And just like you wouldn't expect an engineer or a mathematician or a scientist or a medical doctor to feel awkward about being proficient in their own fields, well, pronunciation is a very important skill of language learning. And as a language learner, you should not feel awkward about your abilities, your skills, your field. And as long as you are good at reading in between the lines and understanding those few cases in which it might be out of place, as long as you're good at reading between the lines and have developed a reasonable situational awareness, then you shouldn't worry about it. Just pronounce things right. It is, in fact, you're right. Thank you so much for watching as usual, and thank you for joining Metatron's Academy. See you soon.